welcome back. Tonight, we're going to step quietly into the stone corridors of a medieval castle, but not as lords or ladies. No silks, no feasts, no crowns. We're going to live a single, quiet day in the worn leather shoes of a servant. One of the dozens who woke before dawn and slept long after midnight, who scrubbed the floors with frostbitten fingers, hold chamber pots, dressed noblemen, and never once complained, at least not aloud. This isn't the glamorous side of castle life. It's the real one. Cold, exhausting, and often invisible. And yet it was these servants who kept the fires lit, the sheets clean, and the nobility polished to a shine. Over the next 24 chapters, we'll follow the gentle rhythm of one servant's day, from dawn to dusk. With every slow step, every whispered thought, every moment of exhaustion and grace. But before we slip into that world, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and if you haven't already, tap the like button. Subscribe to the channel for more sleepy stories, and let us know in the comments what forgotten life you'd like to experience next. Now close your eyes if you like, let the world grow quiet, and let's begin our slow descent into the underappreciated, exhausting, and deeply human world of the servants who kept medieval castles alive. The morning in a medieval castle never began with a sunrise. It began in the dark. Before the sky blushed, before the birds stirred, before even the roosters dared cry out, for the servants of Greystone Keep, daybreak meant nothing. Their wake-up call was the deep clang of the kitchen bell. But most of them were already up by then. Soft footsteps on cold stone, a yawn swallowed into a sleeve, a basin filled with icy water that bit their hands like winter itself. In the lowest corner of the eastern servants' quarters, under a rough wool blanket, a girl named Anselma opened her eyes before the first clang echoed through the halls. She didn't stretch. She didn't groan. She simply sat up, tied her worn linen headscarf, and placed her bare feet on the freezing floor. The day had begun. The quarters were hushed, but not silent. Whispers passed between sleepy mouths. A wooden spoon clattered onto the floor and was quickly steam hissed in a nearby kettle that no one would drink from until the lords had had their fill. Anselma's shift began with bread. The loaves had to be shaped, baked, and cooled by the time the lord's children descended into the main hall. Hungry, half-dressed, and already full of opinions, she moved through the scullery with purpose. The air smelled of ash, flour, and old onion skins. The heavy door to the bakery creaked open as she stepped inside, and warm air kissed her cold cheeks. This was the only warmth she'd feel for hours. The dough was still rising, puffed gently under a damp cloth like sleeping animals. She uncovered them one by one and began to shape the loaves with hands that had long since memorized their duty. Not too much pressure, not too soft. 4 fingers curled under, thumbs guiding gently, just like Cook had taught her. In this task, at least there was rhythm, repetition, a soft silence where no one balked orders or corrected her posture. It was one of the few parts of her day that belonged only to her. Outside the kitchen door, the bell rang. Once, then twice. The others would be rising now. Stable boys shaking straw from their hair. Chambermaids scrubbing hearths. Before the ashes could fully cool, a boy named Cedric, already carrying slop buckets to the pigs, whistling to himself like the tune might keep the smell away. Everyone had their posts. Everyone had their pace. In the castle, if you did not move quickly enough, you were seen. And if you were seen, you were blamed. Anselma slid the dough into the oven and stepped back. The heat made her eyes sting. She turned, wiped her hands on her apron, and collected the basket of yesterday's crumbs, to be ground into mash for the guard dogs, or pressed into stuffing for the Lord's meat pie. Nothing was wasted here. Not time, not food, not even effort. And yet, servants were always treated as if they had too much of all three. As the halls began to fill with the sounds of noble life, doors slamming, boots echoing, laughter that did not include them, Anselma slipped into her second task of the day, washing linens. Chamber pots had already been emptied, and the Lord's sheets, spotted with sweat and wine, had to be rinsed in water that steamed against the cold morning air. She carried the bundle over her shoulder, past a tapestry she wasn't allowed to look at too long, and down to the laundry stones near the kitchen drain. The water was freezing, but she didn't flinch. She had long ago learned that cold was nothing compared to being scolded. She worked in silence. Beside her, a girl named Rhea hummed under her breath. "New cuts on the lady's sheets again," Rhea whispered. Anselma didn't respond. She simply dipped another cloth into the basin and scrubbed. Sometimes it was better not to hear, better not to know. When the sun finally pushed through the high, narrow windows, it brought no warmth, only light, thin as parchment, dusty as old books, and just as far out of reach. By midday, Anselma would be helping in the great hall, sweeping crumbs before the nobles stepped on them. Later, she'd polish brass until her fingers ached. Before dusk, she'd carry water upstairs again and hope none of it spilled. But for now, in the quiet steam of the laundry corner, she scrubbed, breathed, and listened to the world above move on without her. The life of a servant was not marked by events. It was marked by the absence of rest. And in that stillness, in that constant motion, Anselma began her day, just as she always did. Invisible, but entirely necessary. By the time the great hall stirred with life, Anselma was already there. Broom in hand, sleeves damp, the scent of soap clinging to her skin. The space was vast, with high beams that disappeared into the shadows above. Golden light filtered in through the arrow-slit windows, soft as breath, making the dust shimmer mid-her like drifting snow. But there was no time to admire beauty here. Servants were not meant to look up, only down, at floors that needed sweeping, at stains that must vanish, at crumbs that had no place under the feet of the Lord. Anselma moved between the long tables with practiced steps, brushing away the signs of last night's feast. The nobles had laughed, thrown bones at each other, spilled wine like it grew from the walls. She had watched them, quiet in the shadows, holding a pitcher for when they summoned her. Now she cleaned what they had left behind: cold grease, cracked bread crusts, chicken feathers and orange peels. Each pile told a story, but no one wanted to hear it. Rhea entered with a bundle of fresh rushes for the floor. They would scatter the herbs beneath the benches to cover the scent of old ale and damp wood. Lavender, mint, and dried marjoram, a fake freshness, one that lasted only until Boots scuffed it away. "There's going to be a guest at supper," Rhea murmured. Anselma looked up just briefly. "Cook's been beating the dough twice as long, and the master ordered the silver." Anselma nodded, not because she cared who the guest was, but because it meant more work, more mess, more wine to pour, more chances to be scolded if a fork went missing or a bowl wasn't warm enough. The great hall had a strange rhythm. It was empty, then bustling, then silent again, like a sea that only nobles could sail. But the servants were always there, before the lords came, after they left. Ghosts with hands and aching backs. Anselma knelt to polish the edge of the fireplace. Soot clung to her fingernails and turned the skin beneath them black. She didn't mind. She had learned that dirty hands meant less chance of being noticed, and being noticed in a noble hall rarely ended well. In the corner, the steward's bell rang once. That meant the Lord would descend soon. Everything had to be perfect. No ash in the air, no uneven candle wicks, no crumbs on the bench. Anselma straightened the wooden goblets, tugged at the corner of a wrinkled cloth, adjusted the log in the hearth so it crackled just right. Then she stepped back and took her place in the shadows behind the servants' pillar. The nobles entered with rustling fabrics and echoing steps. A boy trailed behind a woman in silk, and Anselma recognized him. The youngest of the house, who had once tied her apron to the garden gate as a joke. The woman didn't look at her. No one did. That was the point. A servant was not supposed to exist when the gentry filled the room. Only the food mattered. The warmth, the clean scent of lavender in the rushes. Everything else, including Anselma, was to be as invisible as possible. But even in silence, she noticed things. The Lord's daughter limped slightly on her left foot. The steward's robe had a patch poorly hidden under the sleeve. The tall knight smelled faintly of blood, though his armor gleamed spotless. She took it all in without judgment, without curiosity, just as a broom collects what the wind leaves behind. And someone gathered these pieces and swept them into the corners of her memory. After the hall was full and the nobles were seated, the real work began. Dishes arrived. Bread baskets passed from one side to another. Roasted birds were carved while the fire popped softly in the grate. Anselma poured wine, always from the right, always with a bow, never making eye contact. Once, the steward snapped his fingers at her because the cup had not been turned properly. She didn't flinch. She simply fixed it and stepped away. By the time the meal ended, she would carry 30 more plates, smile twice, and be ignored entirely. And when they left, when the nobles climbed their staircases and retreated to their rooms, she would begin again, sweeping, scraping, washing, as if the meal had never happened, as if she had never been there at all. There were many doors in the castle that no servant dared to enter, but there were also places that only servants ever touched. One of those was the privy, a tall stone nook, tucked behind the west tower, cool, even in summer, shaded by high walls and echoing always with a quiet drip of water somewhere far below. And Soma carried a bucket in each hand, one for ash, one for water. She was used to the weight, used to the smell. The privy work rotated weekly. This was her turn in the corners of the castle, far from the halls of feasting and music. The waste of nobles had to be dealt with, and it always fell to hands like hers. She moved quickly. Every chamber pot had its place. One in the ladies' dressing room, one by the lord's bedpost, to outside the steward's office. They were heavy, and they sloshed, when not balanced carefully. She had learned, long ago, to walk with knees soft and arms steady. The scent of ammonia bit at her nose, but she didn't wrinkle it. Wrinkling one's nose was a luxury. Servants didn't wrinkle, they just continued, and she poured the waste into the chute behind the castle wall. She watched it disappear into darkness, down into a pit no one had seen the bottom of. It smelled of centuries, of rot and damp, of every meal ever served. Eventually leaving again, Rhea joined her with fresh water in a cloth soaked in vinegar. The steward says, "Lady Alfreda wants her room scrubbed twice today," she whispered, as she handed Anselma the cloth. "Did he say why?" "She's expecting company, and she's nervous." They both knew what that meant. The lady was preparing herself. To impress, to seduce, or to endure. In castles, the line between those three was always thin. Anselma carried the freshly rinsed pots back to the upper chamber. She kept her eyes low, in the hallway outside the lady's door. A handmaiden wept quietly, her face pressed into the folds of a curtain. No one stopped. No one asked. Castles were full of quiet crying, tucked behind thick tapestries, and between verses of courtly song. Inside the lady's room, the fire had burned too high. The scent of rose oil clung to the air, thick and artificial. Anselma set the pot down, wiped the edge clean with a dry cloth, and placed it precisely beneath the stool as instructed. The lady didn't look at her, only waved a jeweled hand toward the hearth. Anselma stoked it in silence. She could feel the heat on her cheeks now. Not warmth, but pressure. The way the castle pressed back at its own quiet labor. As she left the room, the lady's gaze flickered toward her. "You smell of ash," she said, flatly. Anselma bowed her head, said nothing, and closed the door softly behind her. By mid-morning, she was back near the laundry, soaking the claws used to wipe the castle's secrets away. Blood-sick spilled wine, the remnants of pleasure, of punishment, of plain old living. It all came to them in linens, in silence, in the yard beyond the laundry stones. Boys were stacking firewood, their hands red from splinters and frost. Cedric, the youngest, was humming again, a tune she didn't recognize. He waved when he saw her. "Is it true the Duke's cousin is arriving tomorrow?" he asked. "That's what Rhea said." That means more servants. Or more work for us. She didn't answer, because both were likely true, and neither was good. There was a moment, just a moment, when Anselma rested her hands on the edge of the basin. The cloth floated in the water, like a lily pad in a still pond. Steam curled into the air, and for half a breath, there was peace. Not happiness, not rest, just quiet. The kind of quiet that had to be claimed in seconds, because soon enough, someone would call her name, or the bell would ring, or the sheets would be stained again. Servants never got to finish a thought, or a breath, or a meal. They only moved from one need to the next, invisible hands holding up the weight of a world that never once turned to say thank you. There were few places in the castle as finely decorated as the ladies' chamber. The floors were strewn with new rushes, laced with dried lavender and rose petals. Tapestries lined the stone walls, hiding the cold with scenes of golden hunts and silver-threaded forests. The ceiling beams were painted with stars, but behind the embroidery, beneath the velvet, a servant still had work to do. Anselma stood quietly in the corner of the room, waiting. The lady sat by the window in a carved wooden chair, her back straight, her fingers braided in her lap. The sunlight fell softly through the leaded glass, patterning her gown with dim light. It was not warm light. It never was. "You may begin," the lady said, voice gentle but flat. Anselma stepped forward, her bare feet muffled by the thick floor covering. She carried a shallow basin of warm water and a length of soft cloth. Today, she would wash the lady's hands and feet, a daily ritual, not for cleanliness, but for poise. It was an act of presentation, the kind of invisible grooming expected of high-born women, and performed, always, by those who could never sit in that window themselves. Kneeling carefully, Anselma dipped the cloth into the water. She wrung it out slowly, let it steam between her fingers, then gently took the lady's right hand. The fingers were cold and thin, but they did not tremble. Anselma passed the cloth over them with slow, practiced motions, between each finger, along each knuckle, up the pale wrist to the edge of a tight silk sleeve. "Do you know how many rooms this castle has?" the lady asked softly, eyes still fixed out the window. Anselma did not answer right away. Servants were not meant to speak, unless invited. 47, the lady said, "and I am only allowed in 10 of them." Her voice wasn't bitter, just tired. Anselma nodded faintly and moved to the other hand. "You walk more rooms than I ever will," the lady added. This time, Anselma looked up. Just for a moment. The lady wasn't looking at her. She never did. But her voice carried something, heavy. When the hands were clean and dried, Anselma moved to the lady's feet. Delicately, she unfastened the soft slippers. They were lined with rabbit fur and had never touched the courtyard soil. Inside the heel was a sprig of lavender, a quiet tradition, a mask for whatever scent might rise after long hours in tight shoes. As she bathed the lady's feet, Anselma wondered what it would feel like to wear slippers just for show, to sit all day and feel tired only from thinking. And yet, there was a loneliness here that felt heavier than the firewood she carried each morning, a quiet kind of captivity. The lady said nothing more. When Anselma was finished, she bowed gently and turned to collect her basin. But just as she reached the door, the lady spoke again. "Do you believe we're all trapped here, or just the ones with windows?" The words settled into the warm air like dust. Anselma didn't respond, because there was no right answer, only a long hallway ahead, and more chores waiting. The corridor beyond the chamber was quiet. Servants passed with baskets of folded cloth, trays of drying herbs, pails of soot from the hearths. They nodded to one another without words. Each knew their tasks by heart. Each moved with quiet urgency. There was no room for wandering minds. Not here. In the lower kitchens, the cook had begun the midday stew. The scent of barley and leek floated through the stone arches. Anselma's stomach stirred, but she didn't pause. Lunch for the servants would come only after the table was cleared. And even then, it might be cold, if it came at all. Her next task was in the solar, the sun-warmed room just off the chapel, where the Lord's daughter did her embroidery. and pretended not to notice the world. Anselma was to fetch a tray of coal and replace the burnt wicks in the oil lamps. She moved slowly, carefully, balancing the iron tray on her hip. The coals glowed faintly. Embers, not flames. Enough to heat a hand, not a room. Inside the sola, the young lady sat, surrounded by silks and threads. Birds, flowers, vines, stitched into cloth with perfect loops, but her face looked blank, not serene, just still. "Did you bring the orange thread I asked for?" she said without looking up. Anselma blinked. No one had told her. "I was not given any." "My lady, of course you weren't," the girl muttered. Then silence. A long, thick silence. Anselma changed the wicks, replaced the coal gently in the brazier, and turned to leave. But as she stepped back, her heel caught the corner of a rug. The tray tipped. One coal fell, just one, and hissed against the stone. She dropped to her knees instantly, pinching the coal in the cloth. No burn, no damage, but the young lady's voice came sharp. "You should be more careful." Anselma bowed her head. "Yes, my lady." She backed away slowly, as if the coal had scorched, not the floor, but the silence. Back in the scullery, Rhea stood scrubbing a pan blackened by last night's fire. "You're pale," she said, without turning. Anselma nodded faintly. "I dropped a coal." Rhea didn't laugh. She only dipped the cloth again, squeezed it twice, and said, "Then today is still better than yesterday." Anselma said nothing, because maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But there was still a long afternoon ahead, and the lords would be hungry again soon. The kitchen was the heart of the castle, though not the warm kind of heart you'd imagine. It pulsed, not with affection, but with orders, fire, and aching feet. At all hours, it beat, with the clatter of spoons, the hiss of dripping fat, and the muttered prayers of servants hoping today's meal didn't burn. Anselma arrived before dawn. The hearth still slept in gray coals. She used the bellows, gently. The embers responded like old men, reluctant but waking. Beside her, Cook Edlin was already slicing onions, her thick arms moving with the rhythm of someone who hadn't stopped since last season. "Get the flour," she said without looking. "We've 6 loaves to finish before the sun hits the chapel window." The flour sat in a barrel in a corner, pale, dusty, and clinging to every breath. Anselma scooped it with care, remembering how one girl last winter had sneezed into the mix and earned a cuff so hard she wept for a week. There were rules in the kitchen, unspoken ones, like never speak unless you know it won't be taken as complaint. Never walk faster than the cook, and never let a crust burn. The dough was heavy, like wet linen. Anselma kneaded with both hands, her palms pushing against the grain. Her shoulders ached already, and the fire hadn't even reached full strength. But bread couldn't wait, not in a castle where the Lord S table had to be overflowing. Even if half the bread ended up scattered beneath chairs, or fed to the hounds. As the loaves rested near the fire, Rhea entered with a bucket of bones. Stew bones, cracked open for marrow. Some still had slivers of meat. Some had clearly been sucked clean by noble teeth. "They want broth," she said, wrinkling her nose. "For the knight who fell from his horse yesterday." "Cook says bone broth helps bruises." Edlin snorted. "Cook says bone broth keeps fools from breaking more bones. That one's got no brains, just armor." They all laughed quietly, even on soft laughter, the kind you hide in your sleeve. The oven crackled. Time to slide the bread in. The door was heavy, iron, and always hotter than you expected. Anselma used a long-handled paddle to nudge each loaf in. The dough hissed as it met the stone. The smell, even raw, was comforting. Warmth, yeast, a hope that something soft would come from all this labor. But the oven had moods. It burned cooler when the wind shifted, hotter when the flue stuck. Today, it burned uneven. The loaves on the left rose tall and golden. The ones on the right slumped, and the rearmost blackened at the base. No, no, Edlin muttered, yanking the tray out. The loaf split, its bottom scorched, its center raw. The cook's face went red. You fed it too close to the ash, she hissed. Didn't you smell it turning? Anselmar lowered her eyes. I was mixing the marrow. I didn't notice. Well, his lordship's dogs will be happy, because no human's eaten that mess. She'll toss the ruined bread toward the hound trough. It landed with a soft thunk. Anselma bit the inside of her cheek. Just once, then returned to cleaning the oven. Later, as the broth simmered, and the surviving loaves cooled on a linen cloth, the steward arrived, trim, tall, and permanently frowning. He didn't greet them, only sniffed the air and tapped a finger on the edge of the prep table. There'll be guests again this evening, he said flatly. 7, possibly 9. Lady Elfrida requests almond tarts, and no onion. Cook Edlin muttered something about fancy stomachs. Anselma nodded. That meant shelling almonds by hand. At least 3 hours' work. For a dessert that would vanish in 3 bites, the afternoon passed in a blur. Boiling, peeling, stirring, sweating. The kitchen filled with steam and the scent of roasted meat. Anselma's apron stuck to her back. The soles of her feet began to throb. And still, the oven hissed, the stew bubbled, and the knife never paused. By evening, the meal was ready, a feast by anyone's measure. But to the servants, it was merely supper. When the trays were carried out, the kitchen quieted just briefly. A moment of breath. Anselma sat on a low bench, pulling her knees up, her back curved like a question mark. Edlin handed her a crust from one of the ruined loaves. Still warm, still soft inside. Not good enough for a lord, she said. But it'll keep your hands moving. Anselma smiled, faintly, and took a bite. It tasted like fire, and salt, and something else too. The knowledge that, come dawn, they'd do it all again. When the last platter was cleared, and the final crust swept from the lord's table, the castle didn't fall asleep. It only changed its rhythm. By candlelight, under torch flicker and shadow, the night belonged to other kinds of tasks. Quieter, colder, and lonelier. Anselma folded a woolen shawl across her shoulders. The corridors were chilled now. The warmth of the ovens long faded. Each breath rose in mist. She walked slowly, past shuttered windows and silent doors, listening for the bell. Because at night, the bell summoned, not meals, but emergencies. A spilled chamber pot, a shivering noble, a sickly cough from the baby in the wet nurse's room. In the lower ward, she found Cedric, the youngest stable boy, curled near the hearth, knees to chest. Didn't they bring you a blanket? She whispered, kneeling. He shook his head, eyes wide but quiet. Anselma unwrapped her shawl and laid it across him. It smelled of flour and smoke, but it was warm. You can return it in the morning, she said gently. The stable smelled of hay and horse breath, a gentle damp, alive and earthy. Anselma had come to check the birth mare. The cook's niece had seen her shifting oddly at dusk. In the rear stall, the mare snorted softly and turned her head. Still no signs, just swollen belly and heavy feet. Anselma ran a gentle hand along her flank. Not tonight. Then, she whispered, maybe tomorrow. She didn't mind. Even the animals, here, were companions in silence. Back in the main hall, the night bell rang once, low and slow. She straightened, heart already half ahead of her feet, and made her way up the narrow spiral stair. The bell meant the old knight was coughing again. Sir Ludogren, he had once served in wars Anselma had only heard of in songs. Now, he lay in a damp room with rattling lungs and eyes that blinked at nothing. She poured warm water from the kettle kept by his heart, wrapped it in cloth, pressed it gently to his chest. He coughed like a cracked drum, and when he finally stilled, he murmured, the river was always colder than the blood. She didn't ask what he meant. She only adjusted his blanket and let the silence cover them both like snow. In the stairwell, The candle in her hand flickered wildly. She shielded it with her palm. Wind, maybe, or a draft from the arrow slits. But tonight, the castle felt restless, like it remembered things. It couldn't say. Rhea met her near the servants' dormitory. "You still awake?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "The bell." Ludigrim again. Anselma nodded. Rhea handed her a crust wrapped in cloth, pilfered from the steward's tray. He didn't finish, and Selma took it gratefully. There was no shame in eating what others left behind. Only survival. The dormitory was a narrow room under the beams. 40 straw pallets, pressed side by side, with barely space to step between. Some had blankets, some had shoes for pillows. All had dreams that no one would ever ask about. Anselma found her a corner, curled on her side, let the straw press into her cheek. Outside, the night moved slowly. Owls called from the woods. A shutter creaked in the north tower. Rain began softly, tapping at the slate roof, like a child too shy to knock. Her eyes closed, not from peace, but from exhaustion. And in her final waking breath, she thought, not of lords, not of ladies, but of warm bread, of horse breath, of Rhea's quiet gift, the real things, the things no tapestries ever showed. The castle's linens were not washed every day. There wasn't time, nor soap enough, nor warmth in the air to dry them swiftly. But when they were washed, it became an ordeal. And tonight, it was the servants' turn. The laundry yard lay behind the kitchen garden. Down a slope slippery with moss, a low stone wall shielded it from wind, but not cold, and not the weight of the work. Anselma tied her shawl tighter. The night was damp, and the moon, high in the black sky, was a full silver coin, water sloshing. In basins already chilled from waiting, the smell of old cloth, hearth smoke, and sour starch filled the air. She picked up a shift, one of Lady Elfreda's, trimmed in lace, and dipped it into the bucket. Her fingers stiffened at once. Rhea was there too, sleeves rolled, hair bound tight. She worked beside the steaming kettle, ladling hot water into smaller tubs. Her face was red from the heat, but her voice calm. "The lace stains worse than the hem. Rub gently, or it frays." Anselma nodded. They had done this before. They would do it again. Each piece of cloth told a story. A faint wine stain, a drop of candle wax, an edge yellowed from sweat. The nobles never saw this part, the quiet, careful undoing of their comfort. But the servants remembered. "Do you think she notices?" Anselma asked. Rhea didn't look up. The Lady Anselma nodded. "When the lace comes back clean, when the hem is pressed straight?" Rhea shrugged. "I think she notices when it isn't." The moon passed behind a cloud. The fire popped once, then dimmed. They rinsed in silence for a while. A rhythm formed by cloth, by breath, by the swirl of water. By midnight, their hands were raw. "What would you be?" Anselma asked softly. "If not a washer?" Rhea rubbed her knuckles and stared at the sky. "A tree. Maybe," she said at last. "They don't move, but they grow anyway." Anselma smiled. "I think I'd be a hawk, but not the kind that hunts. The kind that watches." Rhea nodded. Better to watch than to be watched. The fire began to fade. They folded the damp rags, carried the basins back up the hill, and passed through the kitchen without sound. A few embers still glowed. A cat blinked at them from a shelf. And the whole castle seemed to sleep, even if no one really did. Back in the dormitory, the straw smelled faintly of soap and wet linen. The other girls lay curled in their corners, dreamless, or dreaming of a world with less water and warmer light. Anselma tucked her cold hands under her cloak. She would wake early again tomorrow. There would be soot to sweep, a spoon to mend, a heel of bread to chew. But for now, there was quiet, and stars, and the faint scent of lavender rising from the linen they'd washed. The chapel lay within the oldest part of the castle, its stones darker, its corners cooler, and its silences heavier than anywhere else. It was never locked, but not many went there at this hour. Only the servants, and the dust, and sometimes something else. Anselma was the first to arrive. Her footsteps echoed gently beneath the arched stone ceiling. The light from her candle flickered across carved saints, faded paint, and narrow glass windows black with night. She didn't come to pray. That wasn't her task. She came to clean. The rushes along the floor had grown stale. She'll knelt to gather them, moving slowly. Not out of reverence, but because her knees ached. The scent was earthy, tinged with damp and ashes. Beneath the rushes, the cold stone was bare, unforgiving. Still, it was a quiet kind of work. Rhea arrived soon after, carrying a fresh bundle. She laid them out carefully, not just for cleanliness, but in a pattern of green herbs. Meadowsweet, lavender, thyme. They would release their scent underfoot during the day, masking the mildew that clung to the chapel walls. "Do you ever wonder," Rhea said softly, "if anyone listens when they kneel here?" Anselma looked up. "To their prayers," Rhea nodded. "Or maybe just to the silence they leave behind." They moved to dusty altar. The cloth was thick with wax flecks and dried flowers from last week's vigil. It smelled of rosewater and old books. Anselma lifted one corner, shaking it gently over a basin. A silver chalice glinted beneath, untouched, still polished from the last feast day. It wasn't her place to touch it, only to wipe around it. The candles along the side walls had burned low. She trimmed their wicks one by one, balancing the scissors on the rim of her apron. The tallest one flickered blue for a moment, as if uncertain whether to go out or stay lit. "I heard once," Rhea murmured, "that a candle's color tells you who's in the room with you." Anselma paused. "Someone you can't see." Rhea only nodded, half smiling. Then they worked in silence for a while longer. When the bell for lauds rang, faint and distant from the tower, the castle began to stir. Not loudly, just enough that the air shifted. A servant passed the door, arms full of firewood. Another crossed the courtyard, boots soft against frost. The chapel didn't change, but Anselma did feel a stillness settled there. The kind that comes not from peace, but from centuries of watching. Before they left, Rhea stopped beside the small wooden confessional. She didn't go inside, just rested her hand on the old curtain. "If you had only one thing to confess," she asked, "what would it be?" Anselma smiled faintly. "That I don't regret stealing the candied nuts." Lastule they both laughed, soft and quick. "You only took two," Rhea said. "They were the best two I've ever tasted." As the first gray light began to show at the chapel window, they stepped outside. The castle courtyard was pale and still. Above them, chimney smoke rose into the sky like ribboned silk. The frost cracked gently beneath their feet. Anselma paused at the garden's edge. She could already hear someone chopping kindling behind the kitchens. She'd be needed soon, but just for this moment, she'll let her breath cloud in the morning air, let her fingers rest, and let the quiet linger. The kind of quiet only stone remembers. There was a room tucked just beneath the south turret, barely wide enough to turn around in, where cloth, needles, and silence lived. They called it the seamstress's corner, though no seamstress had ever worked there by choice. Anselma was sent that morning to mend a tier in one of Lord Brenwick's hunting cloaks. The green one, lined in sable, the one that dragged along the floors and caught Bramble in the woods, and still had a faint streak of dried blood on the hem from his last boar hunt. She sighed, but said nothing. She gathered her basket, threaded her bone needle, and climbed the stairs slowly, past the buttery, past the turret, and finally into the seamstress's cell. It smelled of dust and wool, and something older, lanolin from the last fleece, or maybe just time itself. A single narrow window let in a crooked shaft of light. The wind moaned faintly in the stones. She laid the cloak across her lap. Its weight was like a sleeping dog. The tear was deep, right across the shoulder seam, a place not easy to hide and harder to repair. She set her thread, bent forward, and began to stitch. It wasn't glamorous work, but there was a kind of stillness in it, a rhythm that wrapped around her fingers, her thoughts, her breath. Push, pull, not loop, tug, snip, Time passed quietly that way. She imagined that for every stitch, she pushed away one of her worries, until the pile at her feet was threadbare and thin. Outside the slit of a window, she saw crows gathering along the thatched rooftops, black as spilled ink, sharp-eyed, watching. Not unlike the nobles, she thought. The door creaked, and Rhea entered, carrying a bundle of torn aprons. "Kitchen's eaten another 3, she said, smiling tiredly. Anselma reached for one. The apron strings were frayed, and a small burn marked the corner. "Fire again," Rhea nodded. The lad dropped the poker onto the stew towel, nearly caught the meat spit. They both chuckled quietly, so the stones wouldn't echo. They worked side by side for a while. 2 girls, 2 needles, patching a world that never stayed whole. On the wall hung a small, cross-stitched sampler, faded by years, its message barely readable in the sun-bleached thread. Labor in silence, love in shadow, rest in the next life. Rhea stared at it for a long time. "Do you think they meant that kindly?" she asked. Anselma didn't answer at first. She pulled another knot tight, then, softly, "I think it was the only way they knew how to hope." By late morning, the cloak was mended, the apron stacked, the needles tucked back in their roll. Rhea stewed, rubbing her neck. "Next time I'm born," she muttered, "I'll come back as a squirrel. At least then I can choose my tree." Anselma smiled. "And I'll be the tree. You can live in my branches." They left the seamstress's corner quietly. The castle hummed again, full of voices, fire crackle, and footsteps. But in that little room behind the stone, the silence remained, stitched gently into every seam, waiting. There was grandeur in the great hall, but only when the lords were watching. Carved beams, tall banners of linen dyed with rare blues and deep reds. A massive hearth, where deer roasted during feasts. But beneath all that splendor, dirt clung in the corners, and soot settled thick as frost on the walls. And someone, always someone, had to scrub it clean. Today, it was She arrived before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. The fire had burned low overnight, just soft orange coals, now flickering behind iron grates. The hall was silent. The air smelled of wax, smoke, and cold stone. She wrapped her apron tight and dipped her brush into a bucket of lye-soaked water. The floor was flagstone, uneven with age. Between the cracks, crumbs from feasts past still clung. A fishbone, a sliver of nut, a dark stain from a spilled cup. She worked in slow rows, her knees on a sackcloth pad. Scrub, rinse, scrub. Again. Other servants trickled in. Joran the footboy, carrying dry logs for the hearth. Marta with a ladder to clean the wax from the They moved like dancers in a quiet rhythm, each one knowing where to be, what to avoid, and which steps creaked beneath weight. Overhead, sunlight filtered through stained glass. The reds and blues played along the floor, touching her brush and turning the mop water purple. Anselma paused, watching it. The light was soft, holy, almost, but fleeting. It slipped away as the sun climbed higher, leaving gray stone behind. A mouse darted from beneath the table leg. She didn't jump. It was just another inhabitant, like her, surviving quietly in the margins. By mid-morning, her arms ached. The lye stung her knuckles. The floor shimmered with dampness. Rhea appeared with a bowl of water and a rag for her hands. "You'll scrub your fingerprints off one day," she teased. Anselma managed a tired smile. "Maybe then I'll stop being called for everything." They sat together at the edge of the hearth, where the new fire now steam rose gently from the freshly cleaned stone. From behind the curtain, voices echoed. The steward giving orders, the cook complaining about the lack of herbs, a noble child crying over a lost trinket. And through it all, the great hall stood still again, a stage reset, ready for another day of performances. Rhea pointed to the far beam above them. "See that scar in the wood? That's from when the last lord threw his goblet at a minstrel. Missed, I hope," said Anselma. "No, got him right in the shoulder." They laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because sometimes laughter was the only cloth they had to wipe away the day. Ansama rose again. She had one last row to clean. As she dipped her brush back into the bucket, she thought of all the hands before her. The generations of servants who had scrubbed this same floor, under different lords, beneath the same beams. Their names lost, but their labor still echoing beneath every footprint. She finished at noon. The hall gleamed faintly, and the scent of vinegar and ash filled the air. The nobles would arrive soon. They would never know, but the floor would shine beneath their polished shoes, and Anselma's silence would stretch beneath them, smooth, invisible, and unseen. The heart of the castle was not the throne room, nor the chapel, nor the feast hall, grand as it was. The heart of the castle was the kitchen, but only those who served knew it, and only they saw how it truly beat. Slow, smoky, and endless. Anya pushed open the heavy wooden door. The warmth hit her at once. This was the only place in the castle where heat never left. Ovens glowed. Cauldrons bubbled. The air hung thick with steam and soot and sharp, rich smells. Cooks moved like soldiers, arms full of bread, dough, spices, dripping ladles. A boy scraped carrots with fingers already blistered. A girl stirred milk into a pot with quiet desperation, watching it carefully to keep it from burning. No one spoke loudly here. There wasn't time. Anselma was assigned to the hearth this morning, the small one at the back, reserved for pottages and salsa. She crouched beside it, adding split logs from a bundle tied with twine. Each log was damp from last night's rain. They hissed against the coals. She shielded her face from the smoke and waited. When the flame caught, it licked upward, eager and hungry, like everything else in the kitchen. A pot of barley needed stirring. She knelt beside it, spoon in hand, and turned the grains slowly. It was not a task that required thought, but in this place, it was easy to drift inward, to float away on the scent of rosemary and ash. Mist curled near the floor where the warmth met. Cold stone, sweat trickled behind her ear. Her arms ached, but she kept stirring. Push, pause, circle, push again. Marta passed by with a heavy tray of raw fish. Her sleeves rolled high. "You're lucky," she said. "That pot listens to you." Anselma looked up. "Porridge doesn't bite." "No, but cooks do." They shared a fleeting smile, barely enough to register. Before more orders were barked, a bell rang from above. Once, then twice. It meant the Lord's table would want meat soon. Anselma heard the scullions groan. Roast needed basting, gravy needed thickening, and apples, already bruised, needed slicing, thin enough to pass for fresh. In the far corner, a bread oven door opened. The scent drifted through the chaos. Warm, honeyed, soft as a lullaby. Everyone noticed, even if no one spoke of it. The kitchen paused, just for a breath. She took a heel of bread later, when no one was looking. Not out of greed, just hunger. It was still warm, the crust sharp and flaking, the center soft like clouds. She ate it in 3 slow bites. And for that moment, she was not a servant. She was just a girl, hungry and fed. The cook's voice broke the quiet. "Firewood again, girl. And mind you, don't track ash on the meat boards." Anselma wiped her hands on her apron and stood. Another task, another hour. But somewhere in her chest, that stolen bite of bread glowed quietly, like a small, secret fire no one could put out. At the end of the west wing, behind a tall door carved with curling vines, lay the Lady Elfreda's chamber, a room more delicate than grand. Not the grandest in the castle, but the softest. And tonight, Anselma had been sent to prepare it. It was late. The castle glowed with candlelight and smelled of stew and extinguished torches. Outside, the wind tapped lightly at the shutters. Inside, everything waited. The lady would return from prayer soon, and the room had to be just so. Anselma stepped in quietly, holding her breath as the door closed behind her. The bed dominated the space, high and wide, with hangings of pale wool and silk, drawn back like curtains on a play. The mattress was thick with feathers. The coverlet was embroidered with faded roses. She began with the hearth, kneeling. She used the iron poker to stir the glowing embers. The warmth rose at once, gentle, not hot, enough to take the chill from the stone floor. She added a log, carefully. The fire caught with a soft sigh. Then she turned to the table. The lady's writing desk was scattered with ribbons, spindles, a small book, and the scent of rose oil. Anselma straightened each item, placed the book with its edge aligned, shook out the ribbons gently, wiped the dust from the small mirror carved from horn. From the cupboard she brought the water basin. Not too cold, not too warm. She dipped a soft cloth in it and folded it neatly on the tray, beside the lady's carved comb and brush. Then the slippers, placed just beneath the bed, toes pointed outward, ready to slip on, all done without a sound. She moved next to the windows. The shutters were already latched against the night, where she adjusted the curtains. Pale linen, drawn to each side, letting just enough moonlight spill across the floor like poured milk. The door creaked. She turned quickly. It wasn't the lady. It was Rhea, arms full of linens. Bed sheets, she whispered, fresh from the solar. They worked together, lifting the heavy bedding, smoothing the sheets, folding corners in silence. "You ever sleep on one like this?" Rhea asked softly. Anselma shook her head. "I don't think I've ever even dreamed about it." They stood back once it was done. The bed looked untouched, perfect, like it had never been laid in, and never would be again. Before leaving, Anselma lit the last candle, the one near the pillow. Its light was low, golden, enough to read by, or pray, or perhaps remember something long lost. Rhea paused by the door. "She'll notice if the flowers are wilted," she whispered. Anselma turned to the vase. By the bedside, one bloom, a pale violet, its head bowed. She plucked it gently and placed a sprig of sage in its place. "Better?" she asked. "Better," Rhea nodded. The chamber was ready. Everything in its place. Everything prepared for a life far softer than their own. As they stepped into the hall again, the candlelight followed them, flickering on their backs like a fading blessing. Behind them, the ladies' room waited in stillness, bathed in scent and silence. And far below, in the servants' quarters, the straw pallets waited too, without linens, without sage, but full of dreams nonetheless. There was no scent quite like wet wool in winter. Even fresh from the wash, it clung to the skin, heavy, stubborn, reluctant to let go of the dirt or the cold. The castle had no grand laundry room, no steaming cauldrons set indoors, no tiled drains or copper taps, just a slope down to the river, a stack of wooden tubs, and the hands of the lowest-ranked servants. Anselma trudged through the morning frost, arms aching beneath the weight of bundled linens. The air was so crisp it stung her throat with every breath. Her boots crunched over the frost-kissed grass, leaving soft prints behind. "Ahead," the river whispered, a slow-moving current, silver and brown, laced with ice. Along the edges, the sun was still behind the hills. The other girls were already there. Rhea, Marta, a scullery girl named Ellen, barely old enough to carry her own basin. They'd lit a small fire beside the rocks. Its warmth didn't reach far, but it kept the fingers from going numb. They worked quietly, sleeves rolled up, skirts tucked, knees braced on smooth stones. Wooden paddles slapped soaked cloth, soap made from animal fat lathered in their hands. Steam curled from the water, carrying the scent of old sweat, rosemary, and damp moss. Anselma dipped a tunic into the basin and scrubbed. The river didn't mind what they gave it. Blood, grease, wine stains, or worse. It took it all and moved on, just as they had to. "This was the Lord's nephew's," Rhea muttered, lifting a shirt with a smear of dried mud and something darker. "How does one get stains there?" Anselma laughed softly. "I think it's better not to ask." They shared a glance, then dipped the cloth in again. Ellen shivered beside them, her hands red and raw. Rhea reached over and placed a warm stone in her lap. "One day left by the fire. You'll feel your fingers again soon," she said gently. The girl gave a small, grateful nod. The sun rose slowly, filtering through the bare trees. Birdsong trickled into the silence. A robin, distant, then nearer. The sound of wings on water. The rush of the river never stopped. Once cleaned, the linens were wrung out, twisted with the full weight of arms and hips and aching backs, then laid across woven racks to dry in the cold breeze. The wind would do the rest. Not quickly, not kindly, but enough. When the work was done, they sat on their heels and stretched their arms. Their hands were cracked and soaked, but the air felt sweeter now, as if the river had taken some small burden from them and whispered back something kind. Marta pulled out a crust of bread from her apron and broke it into four. They passed it quietly. A shared loaf, a silent blessing. Anselma looked at the ripples of water. A reflection of herself shimmered for a moment. Not as she was now, but perhaps as she once was, or would be again. Then the wind picked up. Time to carry the drying racks back, to climb the slope with sore legs, to pretend their own garments were never soaked, never stained, never theirs to clean. But in that moment, by the river, with the scent of soap and the hush of trees, something like peace had passed between them. Brief, barely noticed, but real. Not all servants remained within the castle walls. Some were chosen for errands, quiet journeys across muddy roads, carrying words instead of water, and secrets instead of silver. Today, it was Anselma's turn. The steward handed her a folded letter sealed with a wax crest. "To the manor east of the wood," he said. "Write quickly. Return before dusk." She took the message without question, though her heart pinched a little. The road east was cold, wild, and long. But to question was to delay, and delay, in a servant's mouth, was a dangerous thing. In the stables, she brushed down a gray mare named Bess. The old horse nickered softly, already knowing the saddle before it arrived. The sun had barely cleared the mist as they trotted out of the gate. The world outside the castle was quieter still, just frost on the brambles. A sky, the color of pewter. Birds startled from the hedgerow like breath from a mouth. Anselma held the reins close, the letter tucked inside her bodice. Each hoofbeat matched her pulse. Slow, steady, thoughtful. The woods were not far, but they felt endless. The trees leaned in close, as if listening. Wind sighed through bare branches. Leaves crunched under hoof. She passed a shrine covered in ivy, a wooden cross, weathered and forgotten. Someone had left an offering. An apple, half frozen, untouched by animal or man. Midway through the path, the wind picked up. Anselma pulled her cloak tighter and bent her head. There was no song here, only the whisper of trees and the rhythm of her breath. Finally, the manor rose ahead. Low stone walls, chickens in the yard, and a thin trail of chimney smoke curling. A woman in a homespun gown opened the door. Anselma offered the letter with both hands, eyes low. From Castle Maudlin, steward seal. The woman nodded, accepted it, and disappeared back inside. No reply, no coin, just a nod. The errand was complete. The return journey was slower. The light had begun to fade. Shadows crept over the fields like spilled ink. Her legs ached from the saddle, but something in her chest felt looser. The quiet had entered her, soft and deep. A hush the castle never allowed. She stopped once by a low stone bridge, letting Bess drink from the stream. Anselma crouched beside her and dipped her hands into the cold water. It bit her skin, but cleared her thoughts. There were no commands out here, no bells, no footsteps echoing behind her, just sky and earth and the sound of breath. When she returned, the gates were just closing. A stable boy took the reins. Inside, the castle lights had bloomed. Hundreds of tiny flames behind oiled parchment, flickering like fireflies. Dinner was long over. The kitchen would be dark. but Rhea had left a piece of barley bread wrapped in cloth by Anselma's bed. Still warm, still soft. She ate it slowly, watching the candle gutter. Sleep came like a blanket that night, heavy and kind, and somewhere in her dreams, she rode again beneath the bare trees, free of letters, free of titles, just a girl on a gray horse beneath a gray sky. Brushing a noblewoman's hair might sound like a soft, pleasant task, but for the servant holding the comb, it was a ceremony, a test of grace, and one of the most delicate duties in the castle. Tonight, it was Anselma's turn. The sky outside, the chamber had gone dark, but the fire inside danced low and warm. Lady Elfreda sat before her polished mirror, wrapped in a robe the color of moonlight. Her hair spilled down her back, long, thick, and dark as night ink. Anselma entered quietly, curtsied, and waited. "You may begin," said the lady, without turning. The brush was carved from ash wood, its bristles oiled with lavender. Anselma stepped behind her, hands light, careful. One stroke, two, three. She began at the ends. Always the ends first. To pull at a tangle near the scalp might earn you a glare. Too hard, and you'd be dismissed. Too soft, and you'd be scolded for idleness. The room was hushed, just a soft rasp of bristles through hair, and the occasional pop of the hearth. Anselma's fingers moved with practiced rhythm. Lift, separate, smooth, brush again. Lady Elfreda closed her eyes. "You're gentler than the others," she murmured. "Thank you, my lady." A pause. It's rare. Time passed differently in moments like these. The world outside faded away. There was no more boots on stone or clattering in kitchens. There was just the scent of rosemary in the oil, and the weight of hair in her hands. As she worked, Anselma glimpsed things in the mirror. Not her own face. She never looked that way. But the lady's face, so still, so unreadable. Was she pleased? Lonely? Bored? It was impossible to know. Noble faces were like carved masks, perfect, distant, unchanged. Once the strands were smooth, Anselma gathered them loosely and wove them into a simple braid, not tight, not elaborate, just enough to rest easily on the pillow. She secured the end with a ribbon the color of faded petals. "Done, my lady." Lady Elfreda opened her eyes. For a moment, she looked not at herself, but at Anselma, directly. "You do have a quiet way about you," she said. Anselma didn't know what to say, so she bowed her head. "Go." Then she stepped back, curtsied, and withdrew. The door clicked softly behind her. In the hallway, the air felt cooler. Not cold, just honest. Less perfumed, more real. Down the servants' stairs, past worn stone steps and candle nooks, Anselma made her way back to her cot. Her fingers still smelled faintly of lavender and rosemary. She lay down in the dark, and without realizing it, she reached up and touched her own braid. Just once. No one brushed her hair, but tonight she imagined it. A gentle hand, a warm room, a kind voice. Not as a dream of nobility, but as a dream of tenderness. Something soft, something small, something hers. The great hall roared with music, lutes and pipes, laughter and goblets clinking. 100 candles floated in iron chandeliers, dripping wax like honey from the sky. And beneath them, platters of meat, bowls of fruit, trenchers filled with steaming stew. But none of it was for Ans. Servants stood against the walls, backs straight, eyes low, like shadow seen. There when needed, gone when not. Anselma held a jug of mead in both hands, arms already sore from the weight. One wrong spill, and she'd be scrubbing floors till dawn. The Lord wore crimson silk. His boots were propped on the rushes, and he laughed with his mouth wide, showing too many teeth. Next to him, the lady toyed with a bowl of sugared almonds. They sparkled in the candlelight, a luxury more costly. Instead, she focused on the table, every inch crowded with roasted game, fresh bread, glazed pies, She hadn't eaten since daybreak. A crust of rye and a weak broth. The scent now wrapped around her like a cruel shawl. Garlic and dripping fat, buttered turnips, roasted apples, and cloves. Her stomach growled. She pressed her lips together. Girl, more wine. The command came from a merchant guest, red-faced and already slurring. Anselma stepped forward, poured the ruby liquid into his cup, and stepped back again. No thank you, no glance. At the head of the table, a bard sang of nights and roses. Anselma let the notes drift over her like mist. Not listening, she'll imagined a world where she could eat first, where food wasn't a reward for silence, but simply hers. Behind the hall, in the scullery, platters were scraped bare. The scraps were gathered in a wooden pail. Bones, half-chewed crusts, meat torn from skin. Later, those leftovers would be poured into bowls for the servants. Cold, unseasoned, uncared for, and they'd still eat them gladly. Sometimes, Anselma dreamed of biting into a roasted pear. Warm, golden, not bruised, not shriveled, she imagined, holding it gently. Closing her eyes, letting sweetness fill her mouth until she forgot where she was. The music ended, the guests laughed, and then, as one, they stood. Chairs scraped, plates clattered. The spell broke. Anselma blinked as the silence came rushing in. You may clear the table, barked the steward, and so she did. One by one, servants carried away the remnants of the feast. Heavy trays, stained claws, broken crusts. In the kitchen, smoke still lingered. Anselma sat for a moment near the embers. Rhea passed her a small, sticky bun snuck from the edge of the dessert tray. Hide it in your apron, Anselma did. She ate it slowly on her cot later, after the castle had gone dark. Eyes closed. No music, no silk, just sweetness, just silence. The chapel was the coldest room in the castle. Even in summer, its walls stayed damp. The stone felt like it had forgotten the sun centuries ago. But still, the bell rang each morning, just before dawn. And still, the servants came. Anselma wrapped her shawl tighter as she slipped through the narrow corridor. The air was silent. Not quiet, but silent. The kind of stillness that wrapped around your shoulders like a heavy cloak. She passed beneath the old arch. The chapel awaited. It was small. Just 6 pews, a narrow altar, and a worn wooden cross. No stained glass, no gold, just stone and wax and shadows. A single candle burned on the altar. Its flame danced, like it, too, was shivering. The priest arrived last, robes simple and thin. He nodded once. No words. The servants gathered, 8 of them this morning, sitting close but not touching. Rhea sat beside Anselma, her hair still braided from sleep. Marta bowed her head, hands clasped so tight her knuckles went white. The prayers began. Soft Latin murmurs that felt like dust. Anselma did not know all the words, but she knew the rhythm. She knew the shape of them in her chest. Behind the altar was a carved figure of the Virgin, her face pale and chipped. One eye was half, but her gaze remained steady. Forgiveness, perhaps, or simply watching. They prayed for the health of the lady. They prayed for the harvest, for the safety of the men who had ridden out 2 days ago, for the child sick in the kitchens. No one prayed for themselves. That would be selfish. That would be noticed. When the priest sprinkled water, it was icy. When he blessed them, they bowed. And then it was done. They rose quietly, back stiff. Their knees left cold marks on the chapel floor. Rhea leaned close. It's warmer in the laundry room, she whispered. Henselama gave a tired smile. Only just. Outside, the sky was beginning to turn. Not yet pink, not yet gold. Just that in-between hush, where dreams still linger. The frost hadn't melted. Their breath still clouded the air, but the silence felt lighter now. Back in the servants' quarters, someone had left a pot of barley tea near the hearth. They sat cross-legged, sipping slowly, letting the heat return to their bones. No one spoke. There was comfort in that, and Selma stared into her cup. It was chipped. The tea was weak, but it was hers, for now, and sometimes that was enough. Outside, the castle stirred. Boots on stone, a dog barking, the first clatter of kitchen pots. The day was beginning again, and they were ready. Tired, sore, and silent, but ready. The castle's winter chill had finally settled in for good. Frost laced the windows like old lace. Water in the basins turned to thin ice overnight. Even the fire in the great hearth struggled to warm the stone walls. The servants wrapped themselves in whatever they could find. Shawls, torn wool, fingerless mitts, but real warmth that came only to a few. The castle seamstress, mistress of ice, had opened the stores today, one by one. The servants filed through her chamber to be issued their winter items. No choosing, no requests, just a nod, a glance, and a bundle handed over. Ansoma waited in the line, her breath visible in the air. Rhea stood ahead of her, bouncing slightly on her heels to keep warm. "Last year, I got one with holes under the arms," she whispered. "At least it had arms," Anselma replied, smiling faintly. Inside, the seamstress measured only with her eyes. She said little. She worked fast. Rhea received a gray cloak with a torn hem. Anselma stepped forward. Mistress of Ice looked her over. From a shelf, she selected a folded bundle. Dark blue wool, lined with something soft. Maybe rabbit fur. A small miracle. Anselma held it in her hands like a newborn lamb. "Thank you, mistress," she said, curtsing low. No answer. Only the rustle of parchment as the seamstress noted her name. Outside, the others gathered in the corridor, inspecting their cloaks and mufflers. "Yours is lovely," Rhea said, running a finger along the soft lining. "I don't know why I got it," Anselma admitted. "Don't question it," Marta muttered. "Luck doesn't knock twice." Later, in the stables, the wind howled through the loose boards. Anselma wore her cloak over 2 thin layers. It made a difference. Not much, but enough. She mucked stalls with stiff fingers, steam rising from the hay, breath puffing like smoke from the horses. Even the animals were quieter now. In the evening, after chores, she sat near the kitchen hearth, cloak wrapped tight. Rhea was mending a stocking. Marta had dozed off, arms crossed. Someone was humming, soft and slow, a tune that had no beginning, no end. Anselma closed her eyes. She thought about the woman who might have worn the cloak before her. Was she still here? Was she gone? Would Anselma's name be stitched into it one day? The fire cracked outside. Snow began to fall. Soft as flour, cold as truth. Anselma thought of her mother then. Her face more imagined than remembered. A lullaby, a hand brushing hair from her forehead in another life. The warmth was faint, but it held. The cloak was hers. For now, and tomorrow, she would rise again. Put it on. Step into the cold, and carry her weight like always. Not all duties came with a broom or a bucket. Some came cloaked in silence, quiet as breath, and twice as dangerous. And Selma learned that quickly. There were places in the castle where servants were meant to be, and places they were not. Corridors that curved strangely. Doors that stayed locked. Rooms that were always dark, no matter the time of day. But messages still had to be carried, and sometimes ears had to stay closed. It was Marta who first warned her. "If you hear your name spoken when you aren't in the room," she said one night, "you never heard it. Understand?" And Selma had nodded. But the warning lived at the back of her thoughts, like a cold draft under a door. One afternoon, while returning empty pitchers from the hall, Anselma passed a door she didn't recognize. Just a narrow wooden frame. No carving, no torch above it, but there were voices inside. Low, urgent. She didn't stop, just walked by with practiced indifference. But something about the tone clung to her like so. Later that week, she was called to bring warmed towels to the ladies' chamber. When she knocked, no one answered. She waited. Knocked again. Still nothing. At last, she entered quietly. The lady was not there, but someone else was. A man, cloaked in black velvet, standing by the window with his back turned. He did not look at her, but he said, "Place them on the chair." She obeyed. "You didn't see me," he said. Her breath caught, but her voice remained steady. "Yes, my lord." Back in the corridor, her hands trembled, but she said nothing, and no one asked. That night, in the laundry, she found Marta alone, stirring the copper pot. "I saw someone I shouldn't have," Anselma whispered. "Then you didn't," Marta replied, without turning. "Secrets flowed through a castle like water in old pipes. You didn't drink from them. You didn't touch them. You let them pass. That was the rule." But Anselma couldn't stop thinking about it. The way the man had stood still, like a statue carved in warning. The way the room had felt too cold, despite the fire still glowing in the hearth. What kind of meetings happened in a lady's chamber with no lady present? She knew better than to ask. But the question curled in her chest, slow and restless. And when she passed that narrow door again, she did not look at it, not even once. That winter, 3 servants disappeared from the castle. One was sent to another manor. They were told. One had taken ill. One had simply left. No one asked where. No one packed their things. No one said their names again. Anselma learned to walk a little quieter, to blink slowly when spoken to never say more than was needed. But in the quiet of her cot, when the hearth had gone dark, and the stars peeked in like small, cold watchers, she sometimes whispered their names under her breath. Not as a risk, as a kindness. The stone beneath the servants' stairwell always held a dampness to it. Even in spring, some said it was old water, seeping up from forgotten wells. Others claimed it was something else, something left behind from the time of plague. No one stayed there longer than they had to, but when illness crept into the castle, it often began there. Marta was the first to cough. Just once, at first. Dry, sharp, but by the second night, it was constant. "It's nothing," she insisted, her voice low. "Drink this," Anselma offered, pressing a cracked clay cup into her hands. Sage and honey. But the honey was thin, and the sage was old, and Marta's fever grew. They couldn't let the steward see. If a servant was found ill, he would report it. If he reported it, they would be removed. Sometimes to the infirmary in the lower yard. Other times, simply gone. Rhea helped tuck extra straw into Marta's cot. They boiled water behind the kitchen's hearth and soaked rags in rosemary when no one watched. They moved like ghosts. Quiet, invisible, careful. But illness doesn't keep secrets. By week's end, 2 more girls were coughing. A boy from the stables fainted at his post. The castle grew nervous. Herbal bundles were hung on door frames. Garlic was strung across the scullery window. The priest was seen more often, sprinkling water, whispering Latin blessings into corners. Anselma's hands grew red from washing linens in icy water. No one asked if she was tired. No one could afford to be. Marta's fever broke on the 5th night. She woke up whispering nonsense about her childhood. A candle, a cat, someone singing in the next room. Anselma held her hand, even when the steward passed by the door. Eyes down, expression still. Just 2 girls. One working, one sleeping. Nothing more. The worst passed, slowly, quietly. It ebbed like water receding after a storm. No grand announcements. No songs of gratitude. Just fewer coughs. Fewer empty beds. The cot next to Marta's remained unfilled. The girl who had slept there simply never returned. No one said her name, but Rhea left a sprig of dried thyme on her pillow one night. Just once. Anselma didn't cry. She kept moving. Hands always working. Scrubbing, folding, boiling, sweeping. But each time she passed the stairwell, she glanced down, and in that cold stone, she sometimes imagined she saw footprints. Faint. Damp. Still walking, long after the body had gone. That night, Anselma tucked Marta's blanket higher over her shoulders. She lit a candle and placed it near the wall, just enough to chase the shadows back a step, just enough to say, "You are not forgotten." The banners went up 3 days before the feast. Scarlet and gold cloth fluttered from the towers. The courtyard bustled with carts bearing apples, nuts, salted fish, wheels of cheese, and crates of wine. Word spread like butter melting on warm bread. A noble wedding, a visiting baron, a celebration unlike any other this winter. But the servants would not attend. Not truly, they would serve it. Anselma woke to bells ringing early. The frost had stiffened her cloak and the laces on her boots. In the corridor, other girls were already preparing, their eyes still heavy with sleep. Rhea was plaiting her hair back in the tightest braid yet. Marta coughed softly into a handkerchief. "Only between trays," Anselma answered, tying her apron tight. By noon, the castle transformed. Rushes were laid fresh on the floors. Candles glowed in every alcove, and the kitchen blazed like a blacksmith's forge. The scent of cinnamon and roasting meat thickened the air, and Selma helped prepare trenches. Slices of bread to catch the juices of boar and hare. Her hands moved with practiced ease, but her heart beat a little quicker. She wanted to see just a glimpse. When the horn sounded, the guests began to arrive. Anselma and the others lined the walls of the great hall, trays in hand, eyes downcast. The noble women shimmered like stars. Velvets in peacock green, headdresses that reached high, pearls nestled in braids. The men wore fur-trimmed cloaks and polished boots. They laughed loudly, poured wine recklessly. The music began. Flutes and fiddles, the kind of rhythm that made your feet twitch even if you were tired. Anselma passed plates of spiced root vegetables, warm meat pies, sweet tarts. She memorized nothing and everything. The lady of the house smiled for the first time in months. The steward stood straighter. Even the cook, red-faced and sweating, nodded in approval once. In the corner, behind a carved pillar, Rhea slipped Anselma a candied almond. "For later," she whispered. Anselma tucked it into her apron with a secret smile. As the music quickened, the guests stood and clapped. A young couple danced. The bride's gown sparkled in the firelight. The servants stilled, watching from the shadows. For a moment, just a moment, Anselma imagined herself in that gown. Not to marry, not to be seen, just to feel the fabric against her skin. Just to know what silk sounded like when it moved. The evening blurred. More wine, more laughter. A dropped goblet, a child asleep beneath a table. Anselma's legs ached, her shoulders throbbed. But she kept serving, kept smiling when noticed, kept invisible when not. When the hall emptied and the guests stumbled off toward their featherbeds, the servants remained. They gathered crusts and doused candle stubs, swept rushes soaked with wine. Later, back in the quarters, Rhea unwrapped a small meat pie she'd hidden. They split it 3 ways. Anselma, Rhea, and Marta. It was cold and wonderful. They ate in silence. The music still echoed faintly in their memories. Not theirs, but close enough to feel like it had brushed past. Anselma placed a candied almond on her cot's wooden ledge. She would eat it tomorrow. Tonight, it was enough just to know it was there. The castle was still, not quiet in the way it was during the midnight watch, when guards murmured and owls cried beyond the battlements. No, this was the hush that came just before the world began again. The breath held before the day exhaled. Anselma woke before the bell. She didn't know why. Perhaps her body had learned a rhythm so well that sleep simply stepped aside. She sat up in the low light, blanket slipping from her shoulders. The air was crisp, but not cruel. A faint pink glow pressed at the high window, announcing the sun before it dared show itself. She looked around. The others still slept. Rhea with one hand curled under her cheek. Marta snoring softly in the corner cot. Their cloaks lay scattered, boots lined, like tired soldiers by the door. And Selma rose quietly. She moved through the familiar corridor. her steps careful on the worn stone. Each turn she took was one she had walked hundreds of times, but this morning it felt different. Not lighter, not easier, just stiller. She passed the chapel. No candle lit, no priest yet, only the faint smell of old wax and prayers left hanging in the air. In the kitchen, she found the fire, already started. The cook, a stout, pale woman with flour always on her sleeve, nodded silently, and Selma nodded back. No words needed. She helped carry the water, warm the pans, split the logs. The castle above still slept, but down here, the world turned in soft clinks and sighs. By the time the sky burned gold at the edges, the first bell sounded slow, heavy. The day had begun. Rhea entered, hair undone, rubbing her eyes. "You're up early." "So are you." They smiled. Marta followed behind, slower but steadier than weeks before. She tied her apron with practiced fingers and stood beside on three hearts that had endured together. Today would bring more dishes, more scrubbing, more orders barked without names. But in this moment, this sliver of time between night's end and duty's beginning, there was peace. The pot of barley porridge steamed gently. A single sparrow chirped near the window slit. Anselma reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the candied almond, the one Rhea had given her at the feast. She split it cleanly with her thumbnail and handed one half to Marta, one to Rhea. No words, only the soft sound of sweetness cracking between teeth. The sun climbed. The boots of the steward echoed above. And Anselma, standing there in the kitchen's quiet warmth, realized she might never be free. She might never wear silk or own a bed that was truly hers. But she had survived. She had stayed. And in the stillness of this morning, before the world asked too much again, she had peace. The snow came late that year. It fell in thin, quiet sheets. Not hurried, not heavy, just gentle. As if even the sky had grown tired. Anselma sat on a low stool by the scullery window, wrapped in her faded blue cloak. The edges were fraying now. The rabbit fur lining had grown thin. But it was still hers, still warm. In her lap rested a scrap of parchment, soft from being folded too many times. She had no ink, no proper pen, just a bit of burnt wood, and an old habit of imagining things never spoken aloud. The letter was addressed to no one, or maybe to everyone she had left behind. To a mother she half remembered, to a sister who'd never existed, to the part of herself that had once dreamed of something far beyond the castle walls. She wrote slowly. Today, the wind sounded like a woman humming. I heard it while carrying linens past the west wall. I stopped to listen, just for a moment. It reminded me, I still have a name. She paused. The charcoal smeared slightly under her thumb. She added, Marta's hand has healed. Rhea sang while we peeled onions. The sky turned orange just before supper. That was enough. She looked out the window. Beyond the walls, the woods wore their winter coat. Bare branches scratched the horizon. But in the distance, a bird moved. A small, fluttering shadow, determined and free. Anselma folded the letter. There was no wax to seal it, no one to deliver it, but she tucked it beneath the loose stone beside her cot, alongside a few other forgotten things. A ribbon, a wooden button, a half-melted candle stub. Tiny proofs that she had lived and noticed and remembered later as the others returned to the quarters, cheeks pink from cold, arms full of firewood and pails. Anselma smiled. She joined them, not because it was duty, but because it was home, in the only way she had come to know it. And above them, the snow kept falling, soft, steady, and silent, just like the life they carried forward. One breath, one footstep, one quiet kindness at a time. The castle did not remember them, not in carvings, not in portraits, not in songs sung by fireside bards. The names of servants were never etched into stone, never passed down in stories. But still, they had lived. They had shaped the days with their hands. They had carved out meaning between the cracks of obedience. Anselma stood in the herb garden as dawn broke. She crushed a sprig of rosemary between her fingers. Its scent sharp, like memory. Behind her, the castle murmured away, and for one moment, she stood, still, breathing, remembering. She thought of Marta's laugh, Ria's stubborn songs, the almond, the candle, the letter never sent. She thought of how they had all survived by noticing things no one else saw. A cracked tile that could trip a noble step. A whisper before it turned into danger. A sunrise that made the chimney shadows dance. They would leave no legacy. No brass plates. No legends. But maybe, just maybe, the castle would remember them in its bones. The worn steps. The smooth handles. The places where hands had worked again and again. That was enough. Later, as Anselma scrubbed the flagstones in the eastern corridor, she hummed to herself. No tune, no words, just sound. And from far away, maybe from the topmost turret, someone hummed back. Or maybe it was the wind,